Good morning, everybody, and welcome to episode 15 of the Daily Grind. My name is Michael Price. I am your host, and today we're going to be talking about the law of identity. Before we get into it, I do want to say I started a little bit early this morning. I may do that from time to time because I'm a fairly busy person. I imagine most of you are as well, so I hope you're understanding that if I am running ahead of schedule, I may go ahead and get started a little bit early. But what we discussed in the last episode was the law of reality, which simply states that a thing is what it is. That was episode 14 for those who want to go back and look over that, because from this point forward, in a lot of cases, the next law that I give is going to build on the last. And so in order to fully understand what we're talking about, a lot of times we're going to have to go back and start from that. Prior to that, I had done the laws of engagement, and that's just how we're going to have discussions when we do live shows in public locations a little bit later on. We got a little more groundwork to lay before we get that opportunity, but I'm really looking forward to getting to know more of the community around here, and eventually more of who we are as a community of human beings as a whole. Maybe getting the opportunity to travel and discuss this method, and not just this method, but discuss lives, discuss how it applies um, in whatever circumstances that each and every one of us are going through. So I'm looking forward to that. Today, as I was saying, we're moving from the law of reality, which I'm trying to see if I have the slide. I probably don't, but if you give me just a moment, I should be able to pull that up for you. Let's see, image. And I'll try to have this better prepared in the future. Hopefully you're able to somewhat see that. If you're on Facebook and you're wanting to see this, if you just type in YouTube and then go to @Burden of Proof Publishing, or you can type in just burdenofproof.live and that'll take you to the YouTube page. Right here it says the law of reality is all that is real is bound by the laws of logic. Laws being a constraint or a boundary. Reality being all that exists. So anything that is not all that exists, according to how we are defining it, is not reality here. Existence is that which is confined by the laws of logic. So nothing that exists is outside the bounds of logic. Simply put, if it is real, it is bound by logic. And now we are going into what those laws of logic actually are. So let me see if I can go ahead and remove that from the screen. All right, perfect. Now, to build on that is the fact that in order to discuss these things, we have to be able to identify them. That's a lot of what we talked about when we did the rules of engagement, is how we're going to identify in order that we don't have any miscommunication when it comes to what we're discussing. And that's where the first two laws about terms came in, law of distinct terms and law of fixed definition. Number one, once you set a law of fixed definition is once you set a term, for the sake of that conversation, make sure that you don't change it, because term shifting just immediately introduces confusion. You could choose to affirm a different definition within the conversation. You can choose to work together to find a new definition. It can get very difficult and dicey, and you still may revert to the basically what you thought it meant before, and slip into having two different conversations and talk past each other without even recognizing it. So what I would advise instead, once you pick a term, stick with it. Then distinct terms. Now, we talked about it in a lot of regards. I hope that you'll go back and check these out. Uh, Basically, like the law of parts, law of composition, say when these two things are apart, now they're two new whole things that each need their own term. In this case, we were calling this the water bottle before. We were calling this, it was a part of the water bottle. When we take it off, this is the lid. Now I need a new term for what this is. Just just for at least the sake of this conversation, because if I still call this the water bottle, now you can be thinking as if the lid was still on it when it really isn't. And that's two different things. And they both need to be identified separately in order to make sure we're having the same discussion. And this may seem unimportant on something, the difference between the lid and not having the lid. But on much bigger discussions of truth, this is vitally important. So I guess we'll go ahead and dive into the image I have for today. Let me see if I can pull that forward here. All right, hopefully everybody can see that. It says the law of identity, that a thing is what it is. Now, a lot of us have heard that, at least I know I did when I was initially learning about the laws of logic. This is the first building block that they give you. But if you skip to straight to this, it already assumes something. It already assumes that something is real in the first place in order for it to be identifiable. And sometimes that assumption is snuck in. Now, there may be some like argument in regard to that. For example, and this is why identity is going to be so important. When we look at the term reality, and we said it was all that exists, so everything that is bound by the laws of logic, and we go to try to we can give that the identity, right? And we did. That identity is reality. We named something true, something real. It's everything that exists. Now, if someone comes along later and tries to add an adjective, if y'all get the chance, go check out the law of adjectives. I believe that's around episode 12, maybe, somewhere in there. 11, 12. It's definitely discussed a little bit in 10 as well, but not as directly. But the law of adjectives basically says that when you add a descriptor to a noun, like an adjective, simply like what I'm holding in my hand right here. Say this before was, I could just call this a cup, right? But I wanted you to recognize this as my brown cup with, it's got little diamonds on it. So that is a particular identifiable feature of this type of cup. If we add the adjective, or we add that it's mine, well, then we know it's the particular one that I own. Each of those things can get really confusing if someone in the conversation later comes along and says cup, or they say brown cup, or they say brown cup with the diamonds, or they say your brown cup with the diamonds. Now we're getting a lot of adjectives. It's getting really complicated. Or we could just have one word for the course of this conversation to describe this particular cup. Because those are all identifiable attributes of this particular cup. And we call it attributes, but it would not be this particular cup without all of them. Just like we couldn't call this water bottle the water bottle we were discussing before once the lid is off without the potential of confusions. The same holds true for this coffee cup here. Hang on, I'm going to get a sip. But that's essentially why identity is so important, is because on a regular basis we do talk past each other simply because we did not identify our terms properly. So next part of the slide says anything that exists, which we said is all that can be bound by the laws of logic, is an identifiable entity. Now down here at the bottom I'll define what these words mean here in just a moment. it also says to be identifiable means to have a specific nature that can be recognized and defined. So my definitions down here is identifiable, able to be recognized and defined, entity, a thing that exists, meaning thing that is bound by the laws of logic, and exists, that which is constrained by the laws of logic. And when it says derivative here, the law of reality, it's talking about, I'm going to try to have these on every single slide that I give. The derivative simply means how the law itself is built, what it relies on to be true, so that you can follow the step progress and check them out yourself if you look up the previous laws to be able to determine how they were derived. So when we come to a new object like this particular cup and we try to put all these different pieces together, we take the attributes of it being brown, diamond being mine, and we give it a new word, and we say, this is the burden of proof coffee cup, or this is the daily grind coffee cup. Now we have a particular identifiable term that can be used to reference, for the sake of this conversation, which particular cup we're talking about. And if we don't do that, then someone later along in that same conversation can slip up and say the cup and be thinking about their own coffee cup, or thinking about, there's all kinds of cups that function in all kinds of ways. And once again, this seems so simple, but we overlook it in practice all of the time. And so much of our communication errors really come from our inability to articulate what it is that we're specifically talking about. And so the law of identity should help us do that. Now, one more clarification that needs to be said when it comes to the law of identity. When I'm talking about that which exists and able to be recognized and defined. So a lot of times people are going to go, well, what about my thoughts? For example, we're going to use the word conceptual reality. We discussed earlier that reality is simply all that exists, which is all that is constrained by the laws of logic. Now, when we add to it that we are discussing a particular type of reality, we've already changed the meaning. It's no longer the same. So when we say conceptual reality, we're thinking what happens in our particular mind, which is not everything that exists. So that's going to need its own term to describe what we're talking about. Or local reality. That's going on experientially in your general range, your general vicinity, near enough by that you can understand that this is what one might call your reality, my reality. But none of those things are actually reality as we have already priorly defined it. So those are going to need new terms. But I wanted to focus in on conceptual reality here because the thought itself, the thought exists, meaning there are brain waves, there is a mental event that's going on when you have a thought, when you have a memory, when you have a dream. That is an actual event, it is an actual occurrence in reality. But what you are dreaming about, what you are thinking about, what you are remembering is not actually happening in reality at that moment, and therefore is not confined by the laws of logic, and therefore is not real by these definitions that I've been giving here. Now, if you still want to call it real when you go home and you think about it that way, absolutely, you're welcome to think of the word reality however you like. But reality is what actually exists, and what actually exists is confined by the laws of logic. And the very first one of those laws is stating that a thing is what it is because anything that exists is an identifiable entity. So when we break that down, anything that is able to be recognized and defined, for example, a thought, for example, a coffee cup, for example, a water bottle, is a thing that exists. And as we said, our definition of exist is that it has to be constrained by the laws of logic. So when we're talking about what is going on inside of that thought, inside of that dream, it is not constrained by the laws of logic. And for the sake of discussion on this show, it won't be considered reality. As I said, the thought itself is reality. What is contained in the thought is not. And so that should pretty much wrap up. I just want to say this is so important because of those first two things we talked about, making sure we have distinct terms and making sure those definitions don't change. It's going to be vital to everything we do moving forward. And to remember that our definition here for this podcast is going to be reality is only one thing, and it's all that exists, which means all that is confined by the laws of logic. And from there we're going to build into the next set of laws, and I'm looking forward to doing that with y'all. Some of these episodes are going to be a little bit shorter than some of the earlier ones because we're only going to be discussing one different law at a time as we move through this, because compounding them can get difficult or confusing, and we need time to try to understand and apply them. So I hope that you try to spend a little bit of time this week when you find something that maybe people could misconstrue, like a house versus a blue house, or a particular blue house, or a coffee cup in general, this particular coffee cup, a brown coffee cup, that we do our best in the conversation to ask questions to make sure we're talking about the same thing and see how much we can improve our communication with one another as this week goes along. So, thank y'all for joining in, and I will talk to you tomorrow for episode 16 of The Daily Grind.